Even after the destruction of Ragnarok, Norse mythology did not end in silence. When the flames died down and the seas withdrew, the universe was not erased, it was transformed. This final belief reveals something crucial about how the Vikings understood existence. Destruction was never absolute, it was a passage, not a conclusion. After Ragnarok, the world was said to rise again from the waters, cleansed but scarred. The earth would become green once more, crops would grow without being sown, the sky would clear. This was not a return to innocence, it was survival after catastrophe. The new world carried memory, not forgetfulness. Some gods would endure. Balder, whose unjust death helped trigger the end, would return from the underworld, symbolizing renewal and restored balance. His presence did not undo the past, but it softened it. Light returned not because darkness was defeated, but because it had already done its worst. A new generation of gods would walk the renewed world, inheriting ruins instead of palaces. They would remember the mistakes of their predecessors. Wisdom would come not from prophecy, but from experience. The universe would continue, but it would continue humbler. Humanity would survive as well. Two figures, Lif and Lifthrasir, would hide during Ragnarok and emerge afterward to repopulate the world. Their survival was not heroic or glorious, it was quiet. This mattered. The Vikings understood that most survival does not look like legend, it looks like endurance in obscurity. This rebirth reshaped how the Vikings viewed struggle. Ragnarok was not a warning to behave better, it was proof that collapse was natural. Civilizations fall, gods die, worlds burn, and yet life returns. Importantly, the reborn world was not guaranteed to be better. It was simply another chance. Norse mythology did not promise perfection after destruction, only continuation. The cycle could begin again, with new conflicts, new failures, and new endings waiting somewhere ahead. This belief made Norse cosmology profoundly different from later religious systems. There was no final victory, no eternal peace, just survival, memory, and repetition. And hope. The Vikings lived knowing that even the end of everything was not the end of meaning. If something could rise again after total ruin, then enduring hardship, even briefly, was never pointless. The fire would come, but so would the world that followed.
As Ragnarok approached, the monsters long restrained by the gods would finally break free. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf bound by trickery, would snap his chains and devour everything in his path. His jaws were said to stretch from earth to sky, consuming gods as easily as men. At the same time, Jormungandr, coiled around Midgard, would rise from the sea, flooding the land and poisoning the sky with his breath. From the underworld would march the dead, led by Hel, while giants would storm the heavens, crossing shattered boundaries that once kept reality intact. Even the sun and moon would not escape. They would be devoured, plunging the world into darkness. The gods did not misunderstand Ragnarok. They knew exactly what it meant: defeat. Not a close battle, not a tragic victory, an absolute end. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent only to collapse, poisoned moments later. No sacrifice, no wisdom, no strength could prevent this outcome. What makes Ragnarok remarkable is not its destruction, but the response to it. The gods did not flee. They did not beg fate for mercy. They armed themselves, gathered their allies, and marched toward a battle they knew they would lose. To the Vikings, Ragnarok was not a failure of the gods. It was the ultimate proof of honor. Knowing the end did not excuse inaction. Meaning came from resistance, not survival. The universe would burn, but it would burn standing. In the Norse worldview, death was not a mystery to be feared.
It was a destination already accounted for. The universe was built with endings in mind, and death was simply one more transition along Yggdrasil's branches. What mattered was not avoiding death, but earning the right kind of ending. The most famous destination was Valhalla, Odin's great hall. But Valhalla was never meant for everyone. It was reserved for those who died bravely in battle, weapon in hand, meeting violence with defiance. Even then, Valhalla was not rest. The dead warriors, the Einherjar, fought each other every day, killing and being killed, only to rise again by nightfall to feast and prepare. Death was not the end of struggle, it was recruitment. Alongside Valhalla existed Folkvangr, ruled by Freya. Half of the fallen were said to go there instead, though little was known about what awaited them. This uncertainty mattered. The Vikings did not obsess over mapping the afterlife. They accepted that not everything was meant to be understood. For those who did not die in battle, there was hell. Contrary to later Christian ideas, hell was not a place of punishment. It was quiet, cold, and colorless, a reflection of deaths without glory. Farmers, children, the elderly, and the sick all ended there. Their fate was not shameful, just unremarkable. The Vikings did not see hell as evil, they saw it as absence. This belief system created a stark moral hierarchy. Glory was earned through action, not goodness. A kind man who died quietly might be loved, but he would not be celebrated. A violent man who faced death unflinchingly would be remembered. Memory mattered more than morality. Death rituals reflected this mindset. The dead were buried with weapons, tools, and symbols of identity, not because they would use them, but because they defined who the person was. To die stripped of your story was worse than dying violently. In the end, Norse belief did not promise justice after death. It promised recognition. You would not be judged, you would be remembered or forgotten. To the Vikings, dying well meant meeting the inevitable with dignity. The universe would end, life would end, but how you faced that ending would echo longer than your breath ever could.
The Norns were not gods, and they were not evil. They simply were. One shaped what had already happened, another shaped what was unfolding, and the third shaped what was yet to come. Together they carved destinies not only for humans, but for the gods themselves. Even Odin, with all his sacrifice and knowledge, could not rewrite what the Norns had decided. He could see fate approaching, but he could never stop it. This belief made Norse mythology brutally honest. There was no illusion of escape. Death was not a punishment for failure, nor was survival a reward for virtue. You lived exactly as long as you were meant to live. What mattered was not how long your thread lasted, but how tightly it was woven. This is why courage mattered so deeply to the Vikings. If the ending was fixed, then fear was pointless. Running from fate did nothing but waste the time you were given. Facing it directly, weapon in hand, gave meaning to existence. A warrior who died screaming was pitied. A warrior who died standing was remembered. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Viking view of death itself. Those who fell bravely in battle were carried to Valhalla, not to rest, but to prepare. Every day they fought, bled, and died again, only to feast and rise once more. Valhalla was not paradise, it was training for the final catastrophe. Fate, in Norse belief, did not exist to be avoided. It existed to be met properly. Even the gods knew how the story would end. They knew betrayal was coming. They knew monsters would break free. They knew the cosmos would burn, and yet they prepared anyway. This worldview taught the Vikings something rare and unsettling. Meaning does not come from winning, it comes from standing firm when defeat is certain, and choosing to face the end without flinching.
All of Norse cosmology bent toward a single, unavoidable event: Ragnarok. This was not a surprise ending or a sudden catastrophe. Ragnarok was embedded into creation itself from the very beginning. The Vikings believed the universe was born with an expiration date, and every age, every war, and every omen was a slow step toward that final collapse. Ragnarok was not triggered by one mistake or one act of evil. It began with imbalance. Bonds weakened, promises broke, natural order frayed. Winters grew longer and crueler. Brothers turned on brothers. The world did not end in fire alone. It ended in moral decay. To the Vikings, social collapse and cosmic collapse were reflections of the same process. In Norse mythology, the cosmos was not held together by harmony, but by tension. The gods themselves existed in a permanent state of conflict, especially with the giants, ancient beings who represented chaos, wilderness, and forces beyond control. This struggle was not a moral battle between good and evil. It was a structural necessity. Without conflict, the universe would collapse. The gods of Asgard were not immortal, perfect beings. They aged, they feared death, and they relied on constant effort to maintain order. Among them stood Thor, the blunt force of the cosmos. Where Odin sought knowledge, Thor delivered violence. His hammer was not a symbol of justice, but of containment. Each time he crushed a giant, he was not winning a war, he was delaying disaster. Thunder, storms, and earthquakes were seen as echoes of this endless struggle, spilling into the human world. Opposite the gods stood the giants, beings older than Asgard itself. They were not villains plotting domination, they were nature unbound. Cold winters, raging seas, wild forests, and hunger all belonged to them. The giants existed to push against order, to test it, weaken it, and eventually break it. The Vikings understood that chaos could not be destroyed, only resisted. Between these forces moved Loki, a figure who embodied instability itself. Loki was not loyal, nor purely hostile. He was contradiction. Sometimes he saved the gods, other times he doomed them. His cleverness created solutions, but his arrogance planted the seeds of catastrophe. To the Vikings, Loki represented the danger of intelligence without restraint, the kind of cleverness that solves one problem while creating 10 more. This constant friction shaped the universe. Peace was temporary, victories were brief. Every feast in Asgard existed because another battle was coming. The gods knew this. That is why they never sought to eliminate their enemies entirely. Total victory would mean stagnation, and stagnation meant decay. For the Vikings, this cosmic conflict mirrored real life. Storms ruined crops, winters killed livestock, war was inevitable. Survival depended on strength, adaptability, and readiness, not hope for lasting peace. The universe, as they believed it, was a battlefield in slow motion. Order and chaos pushed against each other endlessly, and existence survived only in the narrow space between them. Above gods, giants, and humans alike ruled a force even the strongest could not challenge: fate. The Vikings believed that everything, every birth, battle, and death was already woven into existence. This power was embodied by the Norns, 3 ancient beings who lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, quietly shaping reality itself. Below it lay Midgard, the world of humanity. Midgard was not central because humans were important. It was central because humans were vulnerable. Surrounded by oceans and encircled by a massive serpent, Midgard was exposed to chaos on all sides. The Vikings believed their world was constantly under threat, balanced between order and destruction, never fully secure. Beyond Midgard were harsher realms. Jotunheim was a land of giants, ancient beings who embodied chaos, raw nature, and unstoppable forces. Giants were not evil in a moral sense. They were inevitable. Storms, winters, earthquakes, and famine all belonged to their domain. Conflict between gods and giants was not about good versus evil, but control versus collapse. Far below, wrapped around the roots of the tree, lay darker worlds. Niflheim was cold, silent, and lifeless, while hell received those who died without glory. Death was not punishment here. It was simply another destination, another branch on the tree. Crucially, these worlds were not sealed off. Gods walked into human lands, giants invaded divine halls, monsters crossed boundaries when balance failed. The Vikings believed reality was porous, always at risk of being breached. Living within the 9 worlds meant accepting uncertainty. You were never isolated. You were part of a system that could shift, crack, or collapse at any moment. The 9 worlds taught the Vikings that existence was interconnected and that no realm, not even the gods, stood alone. At the heart of the Viking cosmos stood Odin, not as a gentle father god, but as a restless seeker who ruled through knowledge, sacrifice, and fear. To the Norse, wisdom was not something given freely. It had to be taken, stolen, or paid for in pain. Odin understood this better than anyone because he paid more than all others combined. Odin was obsessed with knowing how the universe worked, and more importantly, how it would end. He did not seek comfort or reassurance. He sought truth, even when that truth promised destruction. This obsession drove him to acts no other god would dare. He gave up one of his eyes at the well of wisdom, sacrificing part of his sight in exchange for deeper understanding. From that moment on, Odin saw less of the world, but understood far more of it. Yet even that was not enough. Odin went further, hanging himself from Yggdrasil itself, pierced by his own spear, denying himself food and water. For 9 days and 9 nights he suffered between life and death, not as a martyr, but as a hunter trapping knowledge. From this ordeal he gained the runes, symbols of power, fate, and magic that governed reality. The message was clear: wisdom is born from suffering, not comfort. Odin's rule reflected this philosophy. He did not promise safety to gods or humans. He promised preparation. He sent his ravens across the worlds to gather information. He filled Valhalla not with the innocent, but with the violent and the brave, warriors who could fight when the end came. Even death under Odin's watch became a recruitment tool. Importantly, Odin was not all-knowing. He knew Ragnarok would come, but not how to stop it. His wisdom revealed limits, not solutions. This made him deeply tragic. The most knowledgeable being in the cosmos was also the one most aware of inevitable failure. To the Vikings, Odin embodied a harsh truth about existence. Understanding does not save you, it only prepares you. The universe was not built to reward goodness or punish evil. It rewarded awareness, courage, and endurance. By worshiping Odin, the Vikings accepted a worldview where pain had purpose, sacrifice had meaning, and ignorance was the greatest weakness. Odin did not offer peace, he offered clarity. And in a universe balanced on the edge of destruction, clarity was the most valuable thing of all.
At the very center of Norse belief stood Yggdrasil, not as a symbol, but as the literal structure holding existence together. To the Vikings, the cosmos was not an abstract void of stars and emptiness. It was a living system, organic and fragile, bound together by a colossal ash tree whose roots and branches touched every corner of reality. If Yggdrasil failed, everything failed with it. The tree rose from the depths of existence, its trunk impossibly vast, its bark weathered by ages older than memory. Its branches stretched outward and upward, cradling worlds like fruit on a limb. These branches were said to creak and groan, not from wind, but from the weight of fate itself. The Vikings imagined the universe as something that could be heard, strained, and slowly worn down over time. Yggdrasil was not serene or benevolent. It was constantly under attack. Serpents gnawed at its roots. A dragon chewed endlessly at its base. Deer stripped its leaves. Decay was not an accident. It was built into the system. The Vikings believed that existence was never stable, never safe, and never eternal. Even the structure holding the cosmos together was slowly dying. At the base of Yggdrasil lay sacred wells, each tied to a fundamental force of reality. One was the Well of Wisdom, guarded fiercely and paid for in sacrifice. Another was the Well of Fate, where the destinies of gods and men alike were carved into existence. These waters fed the tree, but they also reminded the gods that knowledge and destiny came at a cost. Importantly, Yggdrasil did not separate gods from humans or the living from the dead. All were connected through the same structure. The Vikings saw themselves not as spectators in the universe, but as participants standing on one of Yggdrasil's branches. Their lives mattered, but not because they were protected, because they were exposed. This worldview shaped everything. If the cosmos itself was fragile, then struggle was natural. If even the gods could not stop decay, then courage mattered more than survival. Yggdrasil taught the Vikings that existence was temporary, interconnected, and constantly threatened, and that meaning came not from permanence, but from how one endured while the tree still stood. From the branches and roots of Yggdrasil emerged the 9 worlds, each one a complete reality of its own, yet never fully separate from the others. To the Vikings, the universe was not layered neatly or arranged logically. It was tangled, overlapping, and sometimes leaking into itself, much like the tree that held it all together. Closest to the gods was Asgard, a fortified world of halls, feasts, and endless preparation for war. This was not a paradise of peace, but a stronghold. Even the gods lived behind walls, knowing that enemies would one day come for them. Asgard existed high among Yggdrasil's branches, but height did not mean safety, it meant responsibility.
The truly dangerous part was confidence. Medieval society wasn't uncertain, it was deeply sure of itself. It believed it understood the world, illness, and God's intentions, and that certainty delayed improvement far longer than ignorance ever could have. From a modern perspective, this looks like stubbornness. From a medieval perspective, it was respect. Respect for elders, for tradition, for authority, even when that authority was quietly leading everyone toward extinction. Humanity didn't just struggle against nature, it handcuffed itself to old ideas and refused to let go, even as the cost became painfully obvious. By the end of it all, the most astonishing thing about medieval humanity is not how close it came to extinction, it's that it didn't actually manage to pull it off. Given the bloodletting, starvation, poisoned medicine, sewage drinking, cat extermination, plague parades, crowded cities, endless wars, smoky lungs, and unwavering loyalty to terrible ideas, survival should not have been on the table. And yet, here we are. Medieval people didn't survive because their systems worked. They survived because humans are remarkably stubborn creatures who keep reproducing even when everything else is going wrong. Survival wasn't engineered. It wasn't planned. It happened in the cracks between disasters, in the pauses between bad decisions, in moments where someone accidentally did the right thing for the wrong reason. Progress came slowly, and usually by accident. Someone noticed that isolating the sick sometimes helped. Someone realized certain water sources made people ill. Someone stopped bleeding patients because too many died immediately afterward. These changes didn't arrive as revolutions, they crept in quietly, often without explanation, long before theory caught up. What truly saved medieval people wasn't intelligence, it was adaptation under pressure. When a practice became so deadly that it threatened entire communities, it eventually softened, shifted, or quietly disappeared, not because society admitted it was wrong, but because continuing it became impossible to ignore. And even then, change was resisted every step of the way. The Middle Ages were not a story of ignorance versus enlightenment. They were a story of humans trapped inside belief systems that once made sense, slowly realizing those systems were killing them, and then arguing about it for several centuries. From a modern perspective, it's easy to laugh. From a historical perspective, it's sobering, because medieval people weren't uniquely foolish. They were doing what humans always do, trusting what feels familiar, obeying authority, clinging to explanations that offer comfort, and avoiding uncertainty at all costs. They almost went extinct, not because they were weak, but because changing how you think is harder than surviving another bad year. In the end, humanity didn't escape the Middle Ages by brilliance alone. It escaped by surviving long enough to question itself. And honestly, that's still how it works today.
Medieval homes were warm, smoky, and deeply committed to damaging your lungs. Fire was essential for survival, but medieval architecture treated smoke like a mild suggestion rather than a lethal problem. Chimneys were optional, ventilation was theoretical, and fresh air was something you experienced briefly while going outside to fetch water and question your life choices. Most peasant homes had an open hearth in the center of the room. The smoke from this fire did not exit efficiently. Instead, it lingered. It curled around rafters, sank back down, and filled living spaces with a thick haze that made your eyes water and your throat feel like it had personally offended the fire. This was not considered dangerous. This was considered cozy. People lived, slept, cooked, and worked in this environment every day. Children grew up breathing smoke the way modern people breathe city air. Coughing was normal, burning eyes were normal, headaches were normal. If you couldn't see clearly across the room, that just meant the fire was doing its job. Over time, this constant exposure took a toll. Chronic respiratory problems were widespread. Lungs weakened, immune systems suffered. When epidemics arrived, these damaged lungs became perfect entry points for illness. What might have been survivable in a healthier body became fatal in one already struggling to breathe. Ironically, smoke was also believed to be protective. Some people thought it purified the air or drove away evil influences. So when disease appeared, the solution was sometimes more smoke, extra fires, more incense, less oxygen. If the plague didn't get you, the atmosphere might. And remember, homes were small. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, wrapped in blankets saturated with smoke. Night after night, lungs absorbed particles that modern doctors would describe with words like extremely concerning. From a modern perspective, medieval indoor living looks like a public health disaster. From a medieval perspective, it was survival. Cold killed faster than smoke, at least in the short term. The long-term consequences were someone else's problem, usually future you. Humanity didn't just warm itself, it slowly smoked itself, and then wondered why breathing felt optional during epidemics. The miracle isn't that medieval people suffered from respiratory illness. The miracle is that they survived long enough to eventually invent chimneys that actually worked. One of the most dangerous things medieval people ever did wasn't burning cats, drinking sewage, or bleeding patients until they fainted. It was something far quieter and far more persistent. They trusted tradition more than evidence, and tradition, unfortunately, had a very impressive body count. In medieval society, knowledge wasn't something you tested, it was something you inherited. If an idea was old, it was correct. If it came from an authority figure, it was unquestionable. And if it had killed people before, that was clearly unrelated and probably God's fault. Medical texts were copied word for centuries, even when their advice consistently failed. Bloodletting worked because Galen said it worked. Dietary restrictions mattered because Aristotle had opinions. Questioning these figures wasn't curiosity, it was arrogance.
and arrogance, everyone knew, was much more dangerous than dying of preventable illness. Observation did happen. People noticed patterns all the time. They saw that certain treatments made patients worse. They noticed that some towns got sicker more often than others. They realized that certain water sources caused problems. But observation without permission meant nothing. If what you saw contradicted tradition, tradition won, and tradition always won. A healer who suggested something new risked ridicule, punishment, or accusations of heresy. A doctor who ignored accepted methods could lose status or livelihood. Even being right didn't protect you. In fact, being right too early was suspicious. Why were you questioning wisdom passed down for generations? What were you hiding? This created a world where deadly ideas survived longer than people. Practices that harmed patients continued simply because they had always been done. Progress moved at the speed of copying manuscripts by candlelight, and only if the copyist approved of the idea.
Medical advice didn't help. Doctors rarely recommended separation. In fact, some believed fresh company lifted the spirits and therefore improved recovery, which may be emotionally true, but biologically disastrous. A single infected person could quietly pass illness to an entire household within days. Even worse, medieval homes were small, poorly ventilated, and filled with smoke. Windows were tiny or non-existent. Fires burned constantly. Air barely moved. If disease wanted to linger, medieval cottages offered premium accommodations. Quarantine as a concept did exist, sort of. Some cities experimented with isolating ships or travelers, but these measures were inconsistent and often ignored. Merchants argued, clergy protested, people snuck in and out. Rules collapsed the moment they became inconvenient. And then there was fear. People worried that isolating the sick might anger God, who had clearly sent illness for a reason. If disease was punishment, separating from it might look like avoidance, and avoidance might invite worse punishment later. Better to endure together than offend divine authority. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic madness. From a medieval perspective, it was compassionate behavior. Society chose emotional unity over biological survival. Without realizing, it was making the worst possible trade. Humanity didn't just fail to contain illness, it embraced it, held its hand, and whispered, "We'll get through this together." Which they did, just not all of them. At a certain point during medieval epidemics, death simply outpaced organization. People didn't stop dying. They just stopped being dealt with properly. And when a society can't keep up with its dead, things get unpleasant very quickly. During major outbreaks, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Graveyards filled, churches overflowed, coffins became optional. Eventually, corpses were stacked in homes, streets, and public spaces like unwanted furniture no one knew where to put. This was not a sign of disrespect, it was a sign of exhaustion. Normally, burial involved ritual, care, and distance from the living. During epidemics, that distance vanished. Families kept dead relatives indoors for days, sometimes longer, waiting for priests, grave diggers, or anyone brave enough to help. The air inside homes grew heavy. The smell announced that something had gone very wrong with the concept of indoors. Mass graves were the emergency solution. Trenches were dug hastily, often near towns, rivers, or wells. Because digging far away required time, energy, and optimism, all of which were in short supply. Bodies were layered quickly, covered thinly, and forgotten out of necessity rather than neglect. This created a problem medieval people did not understand, but absolutely experienced. Decay contaminated water sources. Insects flourished. Animals dug. Rain carried everything downhill. Disease didn't just spread, it soaked back into daily life like a terrible memory that refused to leave. Ironically, fear of the dead made things worse. People believed corpses carried spiritual danger, so they avoided touching them. This delayed burials even further. The dead became untouchable, while the living continued sharing the same spaces, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. In some towns, carts were sent through streets to collect bodies. The call was simple and efficient: bring out your dead. People complied quietly, because arguing required energy they didn't have. Death became routine, familiar, almost administrative. And yet, despite all of this, the response was rarely, "We need to change how we handle this." It was more often, "This is horrible, therefore it must be inevitable." From a modern perspective, leaving corpses among the living looks catastrophic. From a medieval perspective, it was unavoidable. No one had the systems, the manpower, or the knowledge to do better. Not yet. Humanity didn't just struggle against death, it lived beside it, slept near it, and slowly learned the hard way that ignoring decay does not make it go away. At some point, medieval people noticed a troubling pattern. When someone got sick, everyone around them soon followed. This observation was correct. The conclusion they drew from it, however, was complicated. Isolation felt cruel, unchristian, borderline suspicious. If someone was ill, the moral response was not distance, it was closeness. Family members gathered around the sickbed, friends visited, neighbors stopped by to offer prayers, advice, and germs. Leaving someone alone during illness felt like abandonment, and medieval society took abandonment very seriously. So instead of isolating the sick, people did the opposite. They crowded in. Entire households slept in the same room, often the same bed. Sick children were held constantly. Dying parents were surrounded by relatives. This wasn't negligence, it was love. Unfortunately, disease does not respect love. Disease sees love and thinks, "Excellent, more hosts."
Once medieval society accepted that disease wasn't politely staying inside city walls, it needed something to blame. Unfortunately, germs were invisible, and medieval people did not trust invisible things unless they were angels, demons, or deeply judgmental saints. So instead of fighting disease, they fought people. When plague struck, logic packed its bags and left town. Fear took over, and fear demanded a target. Witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, healers, midwives, and anyone slightly unusual suddenly became suspicious. If you lived alone, knew herbs, spoke differently, or had a cat before Chapter 4 happened to it, congratulations, you were now a public health threat. Entire communities became convinced that burning the wrong people would somehow disinfect reality itself. Fires were lit, trials were rushed, evidence was optional, confessions were encouraged with enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If we destroy the source of evil, the sickness will stop. The plague, unfortunately, did not attend these meetings. This strategy had several drawbacks. First, it removed people who were often useful. Midwives and healers were targeted precisely because they were present during illness. Killing them reduced care, not disease. Second, executions created crowds, large, tightly packed, emotionally charged crowds, exactly the environment disease preferred. Third, persecution caused panic. People fled towns to avoid accusations, carrying disease with them into new regions. Others hid symptoms, afraid that coughing too loudly might earn them a trial. Silence replaced honesty, and illness spread quietly behind closed doors. Worst of all, this approach created a dangerous feedback loop. When disease worsened, it proved guilt had not been punished enough. So more people were accused, more fires were lit, more communities destabilized themselves in the middle of an epidemic. From a modern perspective, this looks monstrous. From a medieval perspective, it looked like action. It felt righteous. It gave people the illusion of control in a world where everything else was collapsing. Humanity didn't just misunderstand disease, it declared war on imaginary enemies, and in the process helped extinction along quite efficiently. The plague didn't need to fight humans. Humans did most of the work themselves. When medieval medicine wasn't busy removing blood or banning vegetables, it turned to its next great idea: poison. Not accidental poison, intentional, measured, doctor-approved poison.
because if disease was strong, the cure clearly needed to be stronger, ideally lethal, but in a controlled way. Medieval pharmacies were less healing centers and more experimental hazards. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, sulfur, and various mysterious powders scraped from rocks that had never helped anyone ever. These substances were believed to purge illness from the body by forcing it out violently. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea, all excellent signs. If you felt worse, the medicine was working. Mercury was especially popular. It was shiny, mysterious, and deeply toxic, 3 qualities medieval people found very convincing. Doctors prescribed it for skin diseases, parasites, and general bad vibes. Patients who survived the illness often didn't survive the cure. Those who did were rewarded with nerve damage, madness, and a shortened life expectancy. A win by medieval standards. Lead was everywhere. Pipes, plates, cups, cookware, cosmetics, even medicine. Wine was sometimes sweetened with lead compounds, which gave it a pleasant taste and slowly poisoned anyone who enjoyed it regularly. Entire communities suffered chronic lead poisoning without realizing it, mistaking the symptoms for divine punishment or melancholy. Arsenic had a dual career as both medicine and murder weapon. In tiny doses, it was believed to restore balance. In slightly larger doses, it restored silence. Unfortunately, medieval measurement tools were not precise, and the difference between healing and fatal was often a strong guess and a prayer. What made this especially dangerous was trust. These substances were prescribed by authority figures, doctors, monks, scholars, people trained, respected, and absolutely confident. Patients didn't question them. After all, refusing medicine was irresponsible. If you died, it meant the disease was stronger than the cure. No one considered the alternative explanation. During epidemics, poison treatments multiplied. Desperate people swallowed anything recommended. If one remedy failed, doctors tried another, often stacking poisons on top of poisons, turning sick beds into chemistry experiments with no safety guidelines. From a modern perspective, this is horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was cutting-edge science. Humanity didn't just fight disease blindly, it fought it with toxins and congratulated itself for being proactive.
Medieval cities were marvels of human achievement. Towering walls, bustling markets, narrow streets filled with life, commerce, and, unfortunately, everyone's bodily fluids. If disease were looking for ideal living conditions, medieval urban planning would have won an award. Cities grew fast and vertically, but not intelligently. Houses were packed together so tightly that neighbors could borrow salt through the window. Streets were narrow, dark, and designed more for shadow than sunlight. Fresh air was considered optional. Ventilation was a rumor. People lived on top of each other because land inside city walls was valuable. The solution was simple: stack humans like firewood. Multiple families shared single buildings. Animals lived indoors. Chickens wandered through kitchens. Pigs strolled the streets like they owned the place, which, frankly, they kind of did. Waste management followed the same philosophy as everything else: minimal effort, maximum optimism. Refuse was tossed into the street. Chamber pots were emptied out windows with a polite warning if you were lucky. Rain occasionally washed things away, which was considered a complete sanitation plan. When disease entered this environment, it didn't spread, it exploded. Close living meant constant contact. One cough reached 10 people. One fever meant a household outbreak. One infected rat meant an entire block was negotiating with death by the end of the week. Isolation was nearly impossible. Quarantine meant sleeping 6 inches farther away from the person coughing directly into your face. And yet, medieval cities believed density was safety. Walls kept enemies out, crowds meant protection. The idea that humans themselves could be the threat was uncomfortable. Much easier to blame air, stars, or moral decay than admit that living inside a human beehive might have consequences. Even worse, cities attracted people during crises. When famine or war struck the countryside, peasants flooded into cities seeking food and work. Instead, they found overcrowding, disease, and a fast-track introduction to urban mortality. From the outside, medieval cities looked impressive. From the inside, they functioned like slow-moving incubators. Humanity didn't just suffer from disease, it lovingly constructed the perfect environment for it, brick by brick, wall by wall, person by person. And still, cities grew, because despite everything, people preferred dying together inside walls than alone outside them. When medieval people realized disease wasn't responding to bloodletting, starvation, or cat elimination, they escalated to a bold new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. This was known as the flagellant movement, and it may be one of history's most efficient examples of good intentions doing maximum damage. Flagellants believed plague was divine punishment. The solution, therefore, was to impress God with suffering. Groups of men gathered, stripped down to the waist, and marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains, leather straps, and occasionally enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If God saw enough blood, he would stop the plague. This logic had already failed in hospitals, but hope springs eternal. These processions were not quiet. They were loud, dramatic, and highly contagious, spiritually and biologically. Flagellants sang hymns, drew crowds, and moved directly through densely populated towns. Sick people joined, healthy people joined. Everyone stood close together, breathing deeply, sharing air, sweat, and absolutely everything else. The result was predictable. Wherever the flagellants went, plague followed. Towns that had not yet been affected suddenly found themselves hosting a traveling festival of infection. Instead of isolating disease, medieval society turned it into a touring performance. Authorities occasionally tried to stop them. Some church leaders noticed that whipping yourself while spreading death was not, in fact, working. But by then, the movement had momentum. Flagellants didn't trust doctors, priests, or officials. They trusted pain. Pain felt productive. Pain felt meaningful. Pain looked like action. And so they marched on. The psychological appeal was strong. When everything feels out of control, doing something feels better than doing nothing, even if that something is objectively worse. The flagellants gave people purpose, certainty, and a sense of moral superiority, all while unknowingly accelerating population collapse. From a modern perspective, it's horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was devotion in motion. Humanity didn't just fail to contain disease, it organized it, scheduled it, and sent it on tour. And somehow, miraculously, people still survived long enough to eventually stop doing this. The truly astonishing part is that medieval cities knew something was wrong. People noticed patterns. Sickness followed certain water sources. Entire neighborhoods suffered repeatedly. And yet, without germ theory, the conclusion was never stop drinking that water. It was something unseen is angry. From a modern perspective, medieval sanitation looks horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was logical, traditional, and extremely unfortunate. Humanity didn't just poison itself, it did it efficiently, cooperatively, and every single day, one cup at a time. When disease struck medieval Europe, people desperately searched for a cause. Unfortunately, instead of discovering bacteria, they discovered vibes. And the vibes were bad, very bad. Clearly, something was to blame, and medieval society decided that something was cats. Cats, you see, had a public relations problem. They were quiet, independent, active at night, and occasionally stared into corners like they knew something you didn't. This made them suspicious. During times of plague, suspicion was enough to earn a death sentence. Cats were associated with witches, demons, heresy, and general moral failure, none of which, unfortunately, are known carriers of disease. So medieval communities began killing them, a lot of them. This decision was made with confidence. If cats were evil, and evil caused disease, then fewer cats meant less disease. This is what passed for epidemiology. Unfortunately, cats were also the main predators of rats, and rats, as it turns out, were deeply involved in the entire plague situation. With cats gone, rat populations exploded. Rats moved freely through homes, grain stores, streets, and sleeping areas like they had just received a written invitation. Fleas followed, fleas thrived, and the plague spread faster than ever. At no point did medieval society pause and say, "Interesting, ever since we removed the animals that kill rats, there seem to be more rats." That would have required observation, humility, and admitting a mistake. Three things medieval crisis management actively avoided. Instead, the worsening plague was taken as proof that not enough cats had been eliminated, so the solution was escalated. More cats were killed, sometimes dogs too, just in case. Anything furry and vaguely suspicious became a target. This was not limited to one region. Entire towns participated. Cats were burned, drowned, chased away, or destroyed in public displays meant to cleanse the community spiritually. The rats watched quietly from the shadows, deeply appreciative of the new housing opportunities. The irony is painful. One of humanity's oldest allies, an animal that had lived alongside humans for thousands of years, was removed at the exact moment it was needed most, not because it failed, but because it was misunderstood. From a modern perspective, this looks like tragic comedy. From a medieval perspective, it was righteous action. Humanity didn't just fight disease poorly. It fired the one employee who was actually helping and promoted the rats instead.
Medieval people had many impressive skills: farming without machinery, building cathedrals without calculators, surviving winters that wanted them dead. What they did not have was a working concept of water hygiene, and this oversight nearly erased entire cities. In medieval towns, waste management followed a simple, optimistic principle: not our problem once it leaves the house. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, and anything unpleasant were tossed into the street, dumped into open pits, or politely encouraged toward the nearest river. Rivers, in turn, were assumed to possess magical cleansing powers. If something went into the water upstream, it was clearly gone forever by the time it reached you. Science. Unfortunately, rivers did not share this belief. Medieval cities often built latrines directly over waterways. Entire neighborhoods flushed themselves into the same rivers they later used for drinking, washing, and brewing beer. If you ever wondered why medieval ale was so popular, it's because fermented liquid was statistically safer than water that had recently hosted a parade of human regrets. The result was predictable. One sick person upstream meant everyone downstream was participating in a communal biology experiment. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses spread with ease. Cities became self-sustaining disease machines, proudly recycling their own problems. And when outbreaks happened, no one suspected the water. Why would they? Water looked clean. It tasted fine. It wasn't visibly screaming, "I am poison." Instead, blame went elsewhere: bad air, sinful behavior, foreign influence, or the moon doing something suspicious again. People responded by burning incense, ringing church bells, or fleeing the city, often carrying the disease with them. The water remained untouched, unquestioned, and enthusiastically contaminated. Even attempts at cleanliness made things worse. Washing clothes in rivers added more waste. Slaughterhouses drained directly into streams. Tanners soaked animal hides in water that later flowed into wells. It was an ecosystem of poor decisions working together in perfect harmony. The problem, of course, was availability. During a famine, meat was rare, bread was rationed, and wine was expensive. Fruits and vegetables were often the only things people could find, but eating them felt like gambling with your soul. So peasants made the responsible choice and continued not eating. And when they did eat, digestion was a nightmare. Heavy foods required energy to process, energy sick and starving bodies did not have. People weakened further, their immune systems quietly packing up and leaving town without notice. Medical authorities noticed people getting worse and came to a reasonable conclusion:
the diet was not strict enough. Some doctors advised avoiding food almost entirely during illness because digestion supposedly distracted the body from healing. This meant that during disease outbreaks, people responded by eating less, much less, sometimes nothing. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies deprived of nutrition stopped growing, then stopped fighting infection, then stopped entirely. Entire generations were thinned not by the famine itself, but by the instructions on how to behave during it. And just to make things worse, hunger was often framed as spiritually beneficial. If you were starving, it meant God was testing you. If you died, it meant the test had concluded. From a modern perspective, this is baffling. From a medieval perspective, it was responsible self-control. Humanity didn't just face food shortages, it added rules, fear, and moral pressure to them, and nearly starved itself out of existence, politely, obediently, and with remarkable discipline. The problem, of course, was availability. During a famine, meat was rare, bread was rationed, and wine was expensive. Fruits and vegetables were often the only things people could find. But eating them felt like gambling with your soul, so peasants made the responsible choice and continued not eating. And when they did eat, digestion was a nightmare. Heavy foods required energy to process, energy sick and starving bodies did not have. People weakened further, their immune systems quietly packing up and leaving town without notice. Medical authorities noticed people getting worse and came to a reasonable conclusion. The diet was not strict enough. Some doctors advised avoiding food almost entirely during illness because digestion supposedly distracted the body from healing. This meant that during disease outbreaks, people responded by eating less, much less, sometimes nothing. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies deprived of nutrition stopped growing, then stopped fighting infection, then stopped entirely. Entire generations were thinned not by the famine itself, but by the instructions on how to behave during it. And just to make things worse, hunger was often framed as spiritually beneficial. If you were starving, it meant God was testing you. If you died, it meant the test had concluded. From a modern perspective, this is baffling. From a medieval perspective, it was responsible self-control. Humanity didn't just face food shortages, it added rules, fear, and moral pressure to them, and nearly starved itself out of existence, politely, obediently, and with remarkable discipline. During epidemics, this practice went from questionable to catastrophic. People already suffering from hunger, cold, dehydration, and infection were relieved of the very substance keeping their organs functioning. Immune systems collapsed. Recovery became a rumor. The truly impressive part is that medieval doctors often doubled down. If the patient worsened, that simply meant not enough blood had been removed. The solution to a failing treatment was more treatment. From a modern perspective, this looks like a slow-motion disaster. From a medieval perspective, it was careful, responsible medicine. And that's the terrifying part. Humanity didn't just fight disease, it politely escorted it inside, gave it a knife, and said, "Please take your time." And somehow, against every medical instinct, people survived long enough to stop doing this. Once medieval medicine had finished bleeding people into the afterlife, medieval dietary advice stepped in to make sure anyone left standing didn't recover too comfortably. Because when you're already starving, cold, and diseased, the logical next step is to avoid the few foods that might actually help you survive. During famines and outbreaks, medieval authorities warned people against eating fruits and vegetables, not because they were spoiled, but because they were considered too moist. Moist foods, according to medical theory, corrupted the humors. This was taken very seriously. Apples were suspicious, greens were dangerous. Fresh food in general was viewed as a kind of dietary criminal. Instead, people were encouraged to eat heavy, dry foods, meat, stale bread, thick porridge, and wine. This advice was excellent if you were a well-fed noble with a stocked cellar. For everyone else, it was essentially a starvation strategy with religious backing.
Hey guys, tonight we're talking about all the times medieval humanity came this close to deleting itself. Not because of meteors or monsters, but because of deeply confident bad decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval medicine had a customer satisfaction survey, the results would have been difficult to interpret, mostly because the customers were no longer alive. The core medical philosophy of the Middle Ages was beautifully simple. If something is wrong inside the body, remove fluids until either balance is restored or the patient stops complaining permanently. This approach was called bloodletting, and it was the medieval equivalent of turning off your computer by throwing it out a window, effective in one very specific sense. Doctors believed the human body was ruled by 4 humors, and sickness meant one of them was misbehaving. Which one? That was less important. The cure, regardless of symptoms, was almost always bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Infection? Bloodletting. Cough? Bloodletting. Feeling a bit sad? Bloodletting. Just to stay ahead of things. The reasoning went something like this. Sick people are weak. Therefore, they clearly have too much blood. Remove it, preferably quickly. The process itself was not gentle. Veins were opened with knives, sometimes repeatedly. Leeches were applied and left to do what leeches do best, silently judge your life choices while draining you. Patients were often bled until they fainted, which doctors interpreted as the treatment is working. Unconsciousness was considered a promising sign. Even better, bloodletting wasn't optional, it was mainstream medicine. Refusing it didn't make you cautious, it made you non-compliant, which in medieval terms meant everyone quietly agreed your death was your own fault. Doctors who didn't bleed patients were viewed as suspicious. After all, how could someone be cured if they still had all their blood?